Biology is wholly dependent on chemical reactions in physical systems. Not only are you made mostly of chemical elements such as carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, the interactions of these elements carry out many life processes such as energy production, gas exchange, and chemical digestion. Chemistry is defined as the study of matter and how it interacts with other forms of matter. Before we can begin to even look at living things, we have to see their chemical makeup in the form of atoms and molecules. Matter is anything that takes up space. Elements are unique forms of matter with specific chemical and physical properties that cannot be broken down into smaller substances. 96% of living matter is made of these four atoms: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. The chemical bonding of these atoms, coupled with smaller amounts of other atoms, makes up who you are. One really important rule in biology is
structure dictates function.
if you want to understand how a molecule affects your body, you must first understand its structure. So atoms are the smallest unit of matter and are contained of three subatomic particles. First are protons. Protons are positively charged particles and are located in the nucleus or center of an atom. Neutrons are neutrally charged particles and are also located in the nucleus of the atom. The electrons are negatively charged particles and are located in shells around the nucleus. Each shell can only hold a specific amount of electrons, 2 for the first shell, 8 for the second, and 8 for the third. For the purposes of this class, don't worry about the shell capacity beyond shell number 3. The secret behind the bonding behavior between two or more atoms lie in the behavior of these electrons, especially those in the outermost shell. The most stable or inert atoms have the electrons needed in their outermost shell. This is called the octet rule. The difference between hydrogen and helium, though similar atoms, is so dramatic that blimps, balloons, and similar objects are now filled with helium instead of hydrogen to help these objects float. Both hydrogen and helium are lighter than air and can float, but there's one distinctive difference between hydrogen and helium. Hydrogen is missing its electron in its outermost shell, whereas helium has the two that they need. This was so dramatic that on May 6, 1937, a disaster from the German blimp Hindenburg blew up when the hydrogen gas came in contact with an electrical charge as it landed. Had it been filled with helium, no fire would have broken out. This is because helium has a full set of electrons in its outer shell. Each subatomic particle has a mass. Both protons and neutrons have a mass of 1 atomic mass unit. While electrons are said to have no mass, technically they have a small amount, but too small to be detected. Atoms are called elements. We depict these on the periodic table of elements. This strange Tetris piece was developed by Russian chemist Dmitry Mendeleev, which depicts all 118 known elements. Each row and each column is so placed based on the properties of the atoms there. For example, helium, neon, argon, and all the others down that last column are all known as noble gases, in that they have the full set of electrons in their outer shell and they don't really react with anything else. So how does one read each box in a periodic table? First, the initials are abbreviated Latinized name of the atom. For example, sodium in Latin is natrium, which is why it's presented by Na. Let's focus in on two elements and interpret their meaning on the table. I selected molybdenum. First, you will have the element name in English, then the atomic number. In this case, molybdenum has 42 protons. So the atomic number is the same as the number of protons in any element. The abbreviated letters represent the abbreviated Latinized version of the name. Another assumption is that if the number of protons and number of electrons are equal if there is no charge present. So for every proton which is positively charged, there is an electron which is negatively charged, which cancels out the charge of that particular atom. And finally, the atomic mass is the total number of protons and neutrons in an atom. In this case, molybdenum has 53.94 neutrons. And yes, you can have partial neutrons. Since electrons have no mass and there is no charge on the atom, we assume that the number of protons and electrons is equal. In this case, molybdenum has 42 electrons. With this information, you can build a model of the atom using the info from the periodic table. Carbon has 6 protons as indicated by the atomic number on the diagram. It has 6 electrons, since there's no charge, and 6.011 neutrons, and we get that number by taking 12.011 minus 6 to get the number of neutrons. We're going to go ahead and make it easy and just round that number down to 6. So 6 protons and 6 neutrons, both found in the nucleus, and 6 electrons. However, only 2 can occupy that first shell, and the remaining 4 go into the outer shell. Isotopes are different forms of an element with the same number of protons but different number of neutrons. Remember that if you change the proton number or atomic number changes, the actual element changes into something completely different. Carbon-12 is standard carbon with 6 protons, 6 neutrons, but carbon can come in other forms. This is carbon-14. Carbon-14 has 6 protons and 2 additional neutrons, bringing the total to 8. There are a few applications to isotopes in biology. One of the most important is relative dating in fossils. Carbon-14 is useful for dating more recent fossils like mammoths and human skeletons. For dinosaur bones or older organisms, you will need to turn to other forms of isotopes. These radioisotopes emit neutrons and protons over time. Radioisotopes are unstable and full of energy. As they emit subatomic particles, they become more stable with less potential energy. A little bit more on radiometric dating. As radioisotopes decay, these are often called parent elements, into daughter elements, we can actually get an age range on fossils. Carbon-14 is only useful for recent fossils. If you want more ancient ones, you need uranium-235, which is known as a parent element. So, in simplistic terms, the more radioactive parent elements available, the more recent the fossil was formed. The more stable daughter elements available, the more ancient the fossil is. So older fossils will have more daughter elements with more stable atoms, and recent fossils will have more radioactive isotopes found within there, making them more unstable. For example, trilobites have more daughter and less parent elements than, say, a T-Rex, and in turn, a human. So human fossils will have a lot more radioisotopes in them than, say, older organisms. Now I'm going to demonstrate how to build atoms and isotopes using information from the periodic table using balls from a ball pit. So right now I'm going to model an atom for you. The bowl represents the nucleus, red represents protons, blue represents electrons, and yellow will represent neutrons. So as you can see right now, I built the element hydrogen. 1 proton, 1 electron, that's it. If we want to try to build other atoms, it's best to look at the periodic table. So for this next demonstration, I've decided to do phosphorus. Phosphorus is one of 6 elements found in all living things. Phosphorus contains 15 protons, 16 neutrons. Since there's 15 protons, there'll be 15 electrons. Now, the way the 15 electrons work, we're going to have 2 in the first shell. Alright, the next shell is going to have 8. And that leaves us left over with 5 for the final shell. Whoa. And of course there's 5 for that final shell. Okay, next I'm going to be doing magnesium. Magnesium has 12 protons and an atomic mass of approximately 24. So that's 12 protons, 12 neutrons, and 12 electrons. So what we're going to do is remove 3 of each to make the element magnesium. Okay, right now I'm going back to my model of hydrogen, and I wanted to mention isotopes. And if you remember, isotopes are the same element but differing levels of neutrons. Now, normally hydrogen has no neutrons, at least not a negligible amount anyway. So 1 proton and 1 electron makes a hydrogen. But what if you have hydrogen 2? Well, that would just consist of you adding a neutron. Hydrogen 3 would be an additional neutron. Now, these are considered radioactive at this point. But this is hydrogen 3 when you add 2 additional neutrons, making an isotope. And remember, an isotope does not change the element, just the number of neutrons found within that element. Electrons are housed in shells. Shell number varies depending on the electron. As a rule, each shell has a capacity to the amount of electrons it can carry. First shell carries 2 electrons, second shell carries 8, and the third shell carries 8. The thing is, the first shell must be filled before the second shell is filled, and the second shell has to be filled before the third shell is filled. So valence electrons are unpaired electrons in the outermost shell. These are very important in chemical bonding, which is the attraction between 2 or more atoms. Carbon's valence is what makes carbon so important because it can bind to so many different things. All elements are most stable when their outermost shell is full. This is called the octet rule. However, not all elements have the full set of electrons, and so they achieve the octet rule by binding to other elements. Chemical reactions occur when 2 or more atoms bond together to form molecules consisting of reactants and products. Reactants are what is needed for a chemical reaction to occur. Products are the result of mixing those reactants. So what we're seeing here is carbon dioxide, and you'll notice the G is parenthesized. That is the state of matter. So carbon dioxide gas plus water as a liquid can give us carbonic acid. AQ stands for aqueous, meaning that carbonic acid can dissociate or dissolve in water. Note that the reaction is in chemical equilibrium. Both forward and reverse reactions have the same numbers of each atom. There are 1 carbon, 1 carbon, 1, 2, 3 oxygens, 3 oxygens, and 2 hydrogens, 2 hydrogens. Matter doesn't appear or disappear, it's just moved around due to these reactions. We call this a balanced equation. This reaction is also reversible, meaning that the products and reactants can switch back and forth depending on the enzymes and other factors present. For example, carbonic acid builds up in your bloodstream since plasma is mostly made up of water, and you're constantly making carbon dioxide. However, this can be broken down into the original reactants because of an enzyme in our blood called carbonic anhydrase, which converts carbonic acid back into carbon dioxide and water. Here's another example. Your body contains many different enzymes, which we'll discuss in a later chapter. When liquid hydrogen peroxide is in the presence of these enzymes, specifically catalase, these enzymes will degrade hydrogen peroxide into liquid water and oxygen gas. This is an irreversible reaction, as the hydrogen peroxide is expended. This is represented by a single arrow going in one direction. Let's take a look at another chemical reaction. So what do science professors get their kids for Christmas? Their own lab kits, of course. Here we are making Wizard's Brew by taking liquid vinegar and solid baking soda. While not part of this reaction, we added food coloring and dish soap to make the reaction much more dramatic. When you mix vinegar and baking soda, it yields liquid water, aqueous sodium ions, aqueous acetate, and the bubbles that form are carbon dioxide gas. And yeah, you can try this at home if you want. Chemical bonds join atoms together by the interactions of electrons and their ability to fill the valence shells. The first type of bond is an ionic bond. Ions are atoms that carry a charge. Cations are those that are positively charged, like sodium, and anions are negatively charged, like chlorine. Ionic bonding is similar to covalent bonding, except that electrons are transferred from one atom to another instead of shared equally between 2 atoms. Ionic bonding is defined as the transfer of electrons from one atom to another. In sodium, the outer shell has 1 electron. In chlorine, the outer shell has 7 electrons. And if you follow the octet rule, you want the outer shell to be completely fulfilled. So sodium loses its single electron and donates it to chlorine. Now both atoms have followed the octet rule and have stabilized into a molecule called sodium chloride, also known as table salt, on any of the atoms available. The same is true for methane if you take a look on the chart. Polar bonds, such as water, result in oxygen being more electronegative than hydrogen. This unequal distribution of electrons causes water to bend at the angle that it does. Oxygen, being the most electronegative atom out there in this case, has a partial negative charge. Hydrogen ends up having a partial positive charge. You ever notice how oil and water don't mix? This is because oil is nonpolar and water is polar. The lack of partial charges in oil has no attraction to the water, and therefore they form droplets and are repelled when the two are brought together. No matter.
Okay, so we all know that water and oil don't mix. In fact, as soon as you put these two things together, the oil seems to immediately separate from the water. And why is that? Well, that's because water is polar and oil is nonpolar. And no matter how much I try to force a connection between the two and stir, it still always separates. And the reason behind that is because nonpolar molecules like lipids do not have any partial charges, whereas water, a polar molecule, does. The fact that water has partial charges and lipids do not prevents them from ever trying to force any kind of bond between the two. And that's why these two don't mix.
This final type of bonding in biological systems is called hydrogen bonding. Due to the bending pattern caused by the polarity of water, the hydrogens are left with a partial positive charge and the oxygen end of the water is left with a partial negative charge. This allows the hydrogens to form weak bonds with each other between molecules. Hydrogen bonds are also found in DNA. This is how the two sides of DNA connect. Because the bond is weak, these bonds can be both easily formed and easily broken. Now it goes without saying that all life requires water. So why is water so important? We're going to look at that in our next video.